The great jurisprudential endorsement of the autonomy of the arbitration clause came from, guess who, the French courts, ultimately consecrated by the French Cour de Cassation under the presidency of the very person who had been addressing this arbitration gathering. The second topic was how to police arbitral institutions. The idea was this: if there is such a thing as international arbitration, it is very important that it should not be confusing. It is very important that whatever it is the same all over the world. If we're not careful, there will be a bubble, not to say a babble, of international arbitral institutions, all with very different rules, creating different expectations, operating in a different ethical milieu, and that's very confusing and is not very good. So we should work toward the creation of common standards as to what defines an arbitral institute and how they operate. About removing arbitrators, because that is really a sensitive question, and it should be done the same way by absolutely neutral people according to the same criteria, and it should be very transparent. Well, unlike the separation of arbitration clauses, that is not the way the world has gone. Has the result been the Tower of Babel? I don't know. A bit better than that, I suggest. But you see the importance of that idea, and the fact that nothing like that was actually created is something which we live with today, and we have to wonder from time to time as one institution or another comes under fire for the lack of transparency of their processes. So the importance of engagement is constant, and the more arbitration succeeds, the more there will be instances in which it's criticized, and it's no answer to say, we're great. Nobody believes it. Always has to be shown in action. Moderation is modesty. We are humans. Our bodies are fragile. We cannot indulge ourselves in eating, or drinking, or being angry whenever we do not get what we want. We're shaking our fists at those who don't agree with us. We can't do these things without paying the price. In regard to arbitration, there are specific things, if we don't want to pay this price for immodesty, there are specific things we need to be modest about. As I've already said, we have not invented a permanent, perfect answer. We require rigorous self-appraisal. We require this engagement that I've been talking about with criticism. A little bit more specific. Where we get into trouble, it seems to me, from time to time. One thing that struck me, I don't know how important it is, you might think it's not particularly important, but it's become a bit of a hobby horse of mine. When I hear that arbitration has an incredibly long history, and it's anchored in times long ago, centuries and millennia. And the Ming Chinese did it, the Arabs did it even before Muhammad, and especially after, etc., etc. If you delve into history and you look at what is referred to as antecedents of arbitration, which is so great because it was there even before national courts existed, before the state system was created. If you actually look at these things, it might remind you of something like arbitration because there are forms of dispute resolution, but it's really so far from anything we are doing today that I simply suggest a warning. Don't be too quick to talk about historical parallels between what we are doing today and try to give it some gloss of legitimacy because this has been done for centuries and centuries. It hasn't. Back then it was something else. But I persist, and as I say, 30 years from now, everybody will agree with me, so I Cynthia. Moral hazard is something which we ignore at our peril, and I contend that there is slippage. Somehow taking care of moral issues in international arbitration by making sure that there is an international rule that all arbitrators, even those named unilaterally by a party, shall be and shall remain independent and impartial. We've taken care of an ethical problem by putting that into a rule. And even better, making the arbitrators all sign that. I'm sorry to be a skeptic, but this doesn't do it. And it seems to me that a realistic account of what is happening today, the thing that I was fulminating against and keep talking against, is my fervent wish that we could get away from unilateral appointment of arbitrators. And this is what most people don't agree with. But what I'm saying in that respect is simply we ought to try to find ways of getting away from that particular vehicle for obtaining parties' adhesion. If we look at the past, I was talking to somebody who was relatively active in those early days, the generation before mine, who said that he had read a lecture of mine and said, you make some good points, but I still sit on the fence because I remember the good old days when things really weren't that bad, even though we had unilateral nominations of arbitrators. But I recognize that the world was different then. So if a lawyer had an international arbitration, that would happen once in a while. And you're supposed to appoint an arbitrator. And you sort of tremble at the thought of your responsibility of having an international arbitration. And so what do? I am now allowed to name an arbitrator. I have this important thing called an international arbitration. So I will go and see a great person who will be, and I will show the confidence in my case and the seriousness with which I approach this, and I will ask this eminent person to be an arbitrator. Those were the good old days he's remembering. But there is something to this, because I seem to remember from my early days as well, that there weren't so many cases, and there was a pool of truly eminent people who you approached, not as your friends. You said, would you please consider we have this case, and you write a letter, and you give them information and ask them, is it permissible for us to approach you? Those kinds of people would never do you a favor. They were not professional arbitrators. They'd achieved their eminence in different ways, and their reputation was already made. The world is different today not because people have become worse. The world is different today because international arbitration is so current, and there are so many cases, hundreds and thousands of cases, every year, that these incredibly eminent men, than they were, their number doesn't suffice anymore. And the feeling a lawyer has approaching an arbitration is no longer what it was back then. Oh, now I have an international arbitration, I need to really be careful that I do this in the most excellent way. It's become a routine. And routine, I don't want to sound like I'm too excited about this, beyond saying routine creates slippage. And if we are all quick to see slippage in the conduct of our opponents. And so the opponent does something which is a little bit dodgy, seems to have appointed an arbitrator who is a bit overly friendly and perhaps not challengeable, but gives me I had better even the playing field by doing something similar. That might be the temptation. Or, if that's the way it goes, I can be a bit more relaxed about how I see the qualifications of appointments. Isn't there a slippage in the way these tribunals, which are comprised by an ever-increasing number of people, more or less experienced in arbitration, isn't there a slippage also in the way arbitral tribunals tolerate chicanery as a matter of process? Isn't there a slippage also in the way arbitrators accept appointments in what now becomes a routine and entirely professionalized activity without being very honest about their capacity to face issues of scheduling and the need to give interim relief in cases where it can be absolutely decisive to the entire dispute? Isn't it an ethical issue if overly busy arbitrators accept appointments without any inquiry whatsoever, any concern about the fact that they actually have not a single day available for the next year? Thinking, that's all right, because the merits won't be, surely the merits won't be for another year. Things come up. Is that a reasonable way to behave, and doesn't that have an ethical component? also want to underline the danger about the way we speak about courts. I think those who've been in the arbitration realm for a while do develop some maturity about this and see that the temptation to create an enclave of private justice that just escapes all the horrors of courts are living in an illusion. We simply cannot survive without the cooperation with courts. For a while we can. And you could imagine a state in crisis whose institutions don't function at all. And so a certain segment of society simply opts out and uses this wonderful thing called arbitration, creating private justice that works. That might happen. It might be very good. There are examples of it in countries here and there. Is that sustainable? I don't think so. I think without ultimate cooperation of the state, this is a path of mutually assured destruction, otherwise known as MAD. The collisions between courts and arbitral tribunals occur at two main intersections, as you know. One of them, let's call it broadly, pre-award. The other one is post-award. The former has to do with arbitration's claim to precedence over courts, which otherwise would have jurisdiction to decide a dispute. Will those courts give effect to an alleged agreement to arbitrate? The post-award locus for possible collision has to do with arbitration's claim to finality and effectiveness. Will courts accept and enforce the arbitral award? Thousands of contracts are signed every day, routinely including arbitration clauses. These clauses, in fact, are seldom invoked. Most contracts do not give rise to disputes. But one reason for that is the confidence that parties have in the reliability of the arbitral process and the corresponding expectation that breaches will be effectively sanctioned. Inarticulate awareness, tacit awareness of the New York Convention is now a part of the culture of international commerce. Business managers across the world put their faith in the reliability of contracts entered into with foreigners. They assume that arbitral clauses are dependable, even though they know nothing about the New York Convention. They simply believe that the clauses are there because they generally work. If their advisors have told them that this is so, it is because that's what experience has shown. And so disputes are mostly settled voluntarily because the premise is that contractual rights will otherwise be enforced. The value of this process as a reliable international tool is obvious and it's immeasurable. Its importance is not that it furthers the interest of trade and industry. Its grand achievement is to provide a basis on which international economic exchanges can be carried out in confidence, in a manner that allows development on a long-term basis. Long-term financing, long-term investment, long-term joint enterprise, transfer of technology, transfer of know-how to be repaid over the long term. Without faith in the reliability of contracts, none of these would flourish. International transactions would be reduced to primitive instances of cash and carry and would no longer be commensurate with the demands for innovation and economic development of a growing world population. So, in this perspective, this convention is a great achievement of international cooperation. Still, we must view it without illusion. Its experience has been uneven, although about 150 states are parties to the convention. Anyone familiar with a representative sample of national systems cannot realistically expect it to be, the convention, to be properly and loyally and consistently applied by even half of those 150 countries I mentioned.